The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a distant swarm, their pale glow washing the pediatric ICU in that particular shade of institutional white that never quite felt like daylight. Danielle Ross moved through the unit with the kind of practiced calm that comes from having navigated far worse than dying children, though no one at Sacred Heart would ever know that. Her scrubs were pressed. Her badge hung at exactly the right angle. Her hands, scarred across the knuckles in a pattern that looked almost like old rope burns, moved with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that hesitation costs lives. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the faint warmth of the heating vents as she checked the monitors in Bay 3, Bay 4, then paused at the window of Room 8, where 8-year-old Maya Chen lay sleeping beneath a quilt her mother must have brought from home. The girl's chest rose and fell with the mechanical steadiness of childhood sleep, unaware of the monitors tracking every breath, every heartbeat. Danielle's fingers traced the edge of the doorframe, not entering, just watching. Just the way she always watched. The way people who had held pressure on a severed femoral artery for 40 minutes learned to watch. Dr. Ashford stood at the nurse's station, his shoulders framed by the open doorway to the supply room behind him, his voice low and measured into the phone pressed against his ear. Danielle had caught only fragments as she passed: pricing structure, volume discounts, next quarter's formulary adjustments. She didn't mean to listen. She'd simply been reaching for the extra for pumps they kept in the back, her hand on the cold metal door, when his voice carried through clearly enough that she stopped. Froze. Then continued, because drawing attention to the moment would only make things worse. The phone call lasted another 90 seconds. Danielle counted them the way she counted everything now, in clean numbers, in measurable increments. Her shadow had stretched across the gap at the bottom of the door, visible to anyone who cared to look, and Ashford's eyes had flickered down at the exact moment his voice shifted to something lighter, something designed to sound innocent. She'd seen that particular shift before. In different uniforms. In different languages. In different wars. She withdrew, closing the supply room door with deliberate softness, and continued her rounds. Room 8 belonged to Maya Chen, whose father was a Marine sergeant major who visited every evening at exactly 6:41 p.m., always in dress uniform, always with the careful posture of someone whose body had learned to carry weight that had nothing to do with gravity. He would sit in the visitor's chair that was too small for him and hold his daughter's hand and not speak, which was its own kind of language. His wife, Dr. Helen Chen, came at different times, her laptop perpetually open, her attention divided between the woman in the bed and whatever professional demands pulled at her from the outside world. They were careful not to crowd the medical staff. Grateful. The kind of family that understood hierarchy, that trusted the system, that did not ask questions. Sacred Heart's pediatric ICU was a contained world. 23 beds. 14 monitors. 3 attending physicians on rotation, though Ashford held the primary authority as chief of emergency medicine. 8 nurses on day shift, 6 on nights, and Danielle, who had requested the day rotation specifically because nights meant fewer people watching, and she had built her life on the principle of being watched as little as possible. The unit had its own rhythm, the soft chirp of vital sign alerts, the whisper of pneumatic doors, the low murmur of parents trying not to cry where their children could hear them. The coffee in the break room was perpetually bitter and 4 hours old. The fluorescent lights flickered in a pattern that suggested an electrical problem no one had bothered to fix. Someone had left a greeting card on the bulletin board, "Congratulations on a pregnancy," signed by half the staff. Normal life. Regular people. The kind of existence Danielle had learned to occupy the way an operative occupies a safe house, functionally, temporarily, always with an exit route memorized. She'd worked at Sacred Heart for 7 years now. 7 years of staying visible enough to be useful, invisible enough to be forgotten. 7 years of perfect performance evaluations and 0 conflicts and a personnel file that contained absolutely nothing interesting. Her shift started at 7:15 a.m. and ended at 7:35 p.m., a schedule that meant she overlapped with Dr. Ashford for exactly the busiest part of the day. She knew his patterns. She knew which residents he favored and which nurses he ignored. She knew that he played golf on Thursdays with the hospital administrator and that his wife's maiden name had enough money behind it to insulate him from almost anything except direct evidence of actual misconduct. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that his pharmaceutical rep had just sent a text message confirming the arrangement. $47,000 per quarter for formulary preferences. Quiet money. The kind that moved like blood through the body of a hospital system, nourishing all the right places, going unnoticed until someone asked the wrong questions. Danielle pulled up Maya Chen's chart on the computer terminal near the nurse's station. Fever. Persistent. Responsive to ibuprofen but returning between doses. Blood work pending. The attending's notes were sparse, just the standard protocol entries, nothing that suggested Ashford had spent more than 90 seconds actually examining the girl. She scrolled back to the admission notes from 48 hours prior. Brought in by ambulance. Mother reported the fever started after school on Tuesday. Temperature reading of 104.3 at intake. The usual battery of tests. The girl's father had been there when they arrived. Danielle had seen the moment when he took in the pediatric ICU, the monitors, the other sick children, and something in his expression had shifted. Not panic, he was too trained for panic, but something like recognition. The look of a man understanding that control had left the building. She closed the chart and stood, moving to the supply cart to restock the 4 kits. Her hands moved through the motions automatically, checking expiration dates, organizing by gauge, counting sterile wrappers. Another nurse, Stephanie, from the evening shift coming in early, passed behind her and said nothing. Stephanie used to chat during shift changes. Used to ask about Danielle's weekend. That had stopped about 6 months ago, around the same time Danielle had refused to join the departmental happy hour and had asked to be rotated off a unit where one of Ashford's golf buddies worked. Small requests. Reasonable ones. But requests nonetheless, and in the architecture of hospitals, such things were noted. The day moved forward in its measured way, for placements, vitals checks, medications timed to the minute. By noon, the unit had stabilized. By 1:02 p.m., Danielle stood at room 8's window again, watching the girl sleep. Maya's mother was not at the bedside. Her father had not yet arrived. The monitors showed a heart rate of 118 and a respiratory rate of 24. Elevated. The fever had spiked again despite the ibuprofen, now registering at 103.8. Something about the pattern bothered Danielle, not dramatically, not in the way that set off alarms, but in that quiet way that came from having worked in trauma wards and field hospitals where noticing small deviations meant the difference between a girl walking again or not walking again. She made a note. Added it to the chart. Mentioned it to Ashford when he passed the station, speaking quietly, respectfully, the way nurses spoke to doctors in the hierarchy that governed these places. He glanced at the numbers without truly reading them. Monitor and reassess in 4 hours. Standard protocol. Nothing concerning yet. He was already walking away. Already thinking about something else. Already, Danielle realized, though she couldn't have articulated it yet, already beginning to construct the narrative that would protect him. Because someone had seen something in the supply room. Someone had heard fragments of a phone call designed to be private. Someone was a potential liability in a system built on people not asking difficult questions. That someone was her. The dog tag hung beneath her scrubs on a broken chain, tucked against her skin where no one could see it. Cool. Familiar. A weight that had become so much a part of her body that she sometimes forgot it was there until a moment like this, when her hand absently touched her collarbone and felt the outline of a name she had sworn never to speak aloud again. The fluorescent lights above Trauma Bay 3 buzzed their endless metallic song as Danielle clocked out at 0700 hours. She'd made it through the night shift, her first, the reassignment delivered without explanation during morning briefing. Dr. Ashford had simply pointed at the schedule and walked away. No discussion. No reason. Just a shift change that felt like a door closing. She understood what this was. The supply room shadow under the door gap had been her mistake. She'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see, heard words that pharmaceutical representatives weren't supposed to speak aloud to physicians who had bonus structures tied to prescribing patterns. She'd been invisible for so long it never occurred to her that invisibility could fail. Now she was being moved to nights. Nights meant skeleton crews. Nights meant isolation. Nights meant she'd be too far away from the main hospital rhythm to cause problems, to ask questions, to be anywhere near wherever Dr. Ashford conducted his business. It was strategic. It was calculated. It was efficient. She'd served under officers who understood power. They never raised their voices about the really important things. The next morning during rounds, Danielle was assigned to help document vitals outside Maya Chen's room. She was charting the girl's latest labs when she heard Dr. Ashford's voice rise in that particular tone, the one that carried just enough volume to be heard by everyone within 15 feet but sounded casual enough to seem accidental. "Nurse Ross, these dosage calculations you submitted yesterday." He held a chart at arm's length, reading it like it disgusted him. "Walk me through them. For the family's benefit." It wasn't a request. It was choreography. Danielle turned from her position at the medication dispensary. Through the open door of Maya's room, she could see the girl sitting up in her bed, curious and small against the white pillows. Sergeant Major Chen stood at her daughter's side, his massive frame somehow contracted into the space of a father. Mrs. Chen sat in the plastic visitor's chair, her hands folded in her lap. "The amoxicillin dosage is weight-based," Danielle said quietly. Her voice was level. Practiced. The voice of someone who had long ago learned to occupy space without demanding it. 8-year-old pediatric patients receive 15 milligrams per kilogram every 8 hours. Maya weighs 58 pounds. That converts to 26.3 kilograms. Dosage calculates to 395 milligrams per administration. She'd done this calculation 12 times before. She knew it was correct. Dr. Ashford made a small noise in his throat. "That's not what it says here." "It is correct," Danielle said. "Is it?" He turned the chart, showing it to the family as if they could read the scrawled abbreviations and numbers. "Because according to hospital protocol, pediatric antibiotics require supervisory verification. You simply cannot be trusted to make these calculations independently, can you? We need someone with actual authority to double-check. It's a safety issue." Mrs. Chen looked away. Her hands tightened in her lap. Sergeant Major Chen's breathing changed. Not visible to anyone else. Not to Dr. Ashford. But Danielle heard it, the intake of air that comes when a man watches his child being used as a prop in someone else's power play. "I understand," Danielle said. One measured breath. One single tear escaped her left eye, but she didn't blink, didn't wipe it, didn't break her gaze from Dr. Ashford's face. "I'll request supervisory verification on all future calculations." She said the next part quietly, almost to herself, but the acoustics of the hallway carried it perfectly into the room where Maya was watching and her parents were listening. "I've served under officers who led with fear. Every single one of them failed." Dr. Ashford's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being answered, even when the answer was just an observation about history. He turned away without responding and continued his rounds, but his shoulders had shifted. His stride had sharpened. The casual cruelty of a man who was no longer sure he had full control. Danielle wiped her eye with steady fingers and returned to the medication cart. Behind her, in the room, she heard Sergeant Major Chen place a hand on his daughter's shoulder, a gesture that looked like comfort but felt like someone grounding themselves. By afternoon, the break room had become a geography of exclusion. Danielle sat at the far end of the table with her lunch, a sandwich she'd made at 0400 that morning, the bread already starting to compress into itself, and opened a document on her phone. Just something to look at. Something that said, "I am occupied, I am not expecting company, I am fine alone." 3 nurses from the day shift came in. She'd worked with them for almost 2 years. They nodded at the door. One of them, Margaret, caught her eye for half a second before looking away. They gathered their lunches from the refrigerator. They arranged themselves at the opposite end of the table. They talked about a reality show and someone's weekend plans and whether the vending machine had finally restocked the good granola bars. Their voices had the particular brightness of people performing normalcy very carefully. After 3 minutes, they carried their trays to a different break room. The one on the 4th floor. The one no one usually used. Danielle sat alone with her compressed sandwich and listened to the refrigerator hum. The fluorescent light above her hummed at a different frequency, and somewhere beneath both hums was the sound of the hospital running, thousands of small decisions and vast indifference churning together. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She ate her sandwich and read an article about cloud infrastructure and acted like she had not just been erased from her own workplace. The unit board by the nurses' station was where Dr. Ashford made his statement official. It was written in red ink. That was the first thing Danielle noticed, not blue or black, the normal colors of routine announcements, but red, the color that stopped your eyes. Formal right UP. Name, Danielle Ross, RN. Violation, failure to follow chain of command. Details, unprofessional communication. Insubordination. Improper medication protocols. Recommendation, immediate supervisory oversight required. The pen in red ink had dug into the paper with enough pressure to leave grooves. Danielle traced them with her eyes, reading the physical anger written into the fiber. She stood before it for 43 seconds. Long enough to read every word. Long enough for 2 other nurses to pretend not to notice her standing there. Long enough for the reality of it to settle into her spine like a weight that wasn't actually new, just remembered. 1 measured breath. That was the protocol. That was the composure. 1 single tear traced down her cheek. She felt it, separate from herself, a biological fact that happened to her body. She wiped it with steady fingers before it could fall to her scrubs. Then she turned, and Dr. Ashford was there, standing at the medication dispensary not 5 feet away, watching her with the expression of a man who was testing something. She didn't turn to walk away. She didn't shrink. She met his eyes directly, and her voice came out quiet enough that only he could hear it. "I've served under officers who led with fear," she said. "And I watched every one of them fail." The words landed like a stone in still water. Dr. Ashford's face went very still. His hand paused above a medication bottle. Behind him, a resident pretended to check something on a computer. Danielle turned away and walked back to her station. Her hands were steady as she pulled up patient charts. Her breathing was even. Her composure was complete, and that completeness was a more devastating answer than any argument could have been. But what neither of them knew was that the supply room, the pharmaceutical conversations, the calculated cruelty, none of it was the worst part of what was coming. Because it was 0251 hours when Maya Chen's oxygen saturation began to drop. The monitor's alarm cut through the silence at 0251 hours like a scalpel through skin. Maya Chen's oxygen saturation was dropping. 78. 75. The numbers fell in real time, each beep a hammer strike against the quiet night shift rhythm that had held Sacred Heart's pediatric ICU in its practiced grip for the past 6 hours. Danielle stood at the bedside, reading the waveforms before the next alarms could sound, her eyes tracking the subtle changes in Maya's chest wall that no resident would catch for another 30 seconds. The girl was 8 years old and fighting something her body didn't have the equipment to win against. Tension pneumothorax. Air leaking into the pleural space, collapsing the right lung, pressing on the heart. It was the kind of emergency that killed fast, not with drama but with physics, with pressure gradients and cardiac compression, with a child's small body running out of oxygen 1 second at a time. 72. 70. Danielle moved. No one had paged Dr. Ashford yet. No one had done anything yet. The night nurse assigned to Maya, a cautious second-year named Rebecca, was staring at the monitor as if it might change if she waited long enough. The resident had stepped out 5 minutes ago to chart. The attending was in his office. It was 0251 in the morning and Sacred Heart's pediatric ICU was a cathedral of machines and one unconscious child losing oxygen in increments that would become irreversible in 4 minutes. Danielle's hands were already moving. She grabbed a sterile fur kit from the crash cart, unwrapped it with the kind of practiced precision that came from doing something 400 times before, and didn't waste a single motion. The plastic wrapper, transparent, sterile, the kind that nobody ever thought twice about, became a barrier. The ballpoint pen from the medication cart became a housing. She didn't explain. She didn't ask permission. She didn't do any of the things a civilian nurse was supposed to do in a hospital where protocol and chain of command were supposed to matter more than a child's heartbeat. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath," she said to Rebecca, whose hands had gone motionless. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command that dropped into the room like a change in barometric pressure. Rebecca moved. She didn't know why. Something in the shift of Danielle's voice, a register lower, a tone that carried weight like gravel in a concrete mixer, overrode the hierarchy and the protocols. She grabbed the needle. Danielle's fingers found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Her hand was steady as a surgical platform. She'd done this before. Not in Norfolk. Not in 2024. But the muscle memory lived in her ligaments and her bones and the permanent map the body keeps of everything it survived. This was Bagram in 2003. This was a school collapse and a 5-year-old girl with a severed femoral artery. This was a field hospital in Kandahar where they'd had plastic tubing and prayer and hands that knew what to do because hesitation meant death. The needle went in. Clean. Practiced. The hiss of air escaping from Maya's chest sounded like relief. 68. 71. 74. The oxygen saturation was climbing. Not fast. Not yet. But climbing. The numbers that had been falling like stones were reversing gravity. Danielle's breath was controlled, measured, the kind of breathing that came from having learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury that people in her position could never afford. She secured the improvised seal, wrapper and pen housing, creating a one-way valve that let the pressure out but wouldn't let it back in, with the efficiency of someone who'd improvised worse with less in circumstances that would have broken anyone else. 80. 83. 86. Rebecca was staring at her hands now. Not at the monitor. At Danielle's hands. The movements weren't those of a standard shift nurse. The terminology that had slipped out, intercostal space, pleural space, one-way valve, those weren't words from a hospital protocol manual. Those were field medicine terms. Combat medicine. The kind of language that lived in places where you didn't have a trauma team 5 minutes away. You had whatever was in your rucksack and your training and your willingness to hold a child's life together with plastic and improvisation. A resident named Martinez pushed through the door, the night's chart still in his hands. He stopped moving when he saw what was happening. He didn't understand it yet, but he understood that something fundamental had shifted in the room. The woman in scrubs, the one Dr. Ashford had mentioned in passing, the one the staff had been carefully excluding from break room conversations, she was doing something that shouldn't have been possible. She was saving Maya Chen with materials that shouldn't have worked and a calm that shouldn't have been human. "Who ordered needle decompression?" he asked, but his voice had already answered itself. Nobody. She'd ordered it. She'd done it. She'd done it without the attending, without the resident, without any of the people in the chain of command that Dr. Ashford had spent 3 weeks reminding her mattered more than anything else. 88. 90. 92. Stable. Maya's oxygen saturation had stabilized. The numbers had stopped their free fall and taken up residence in the safe zone. The heart monitor showed a sinus rhythm that was strong and steady and the kind of normal that only existed because one nurse had moved while everyone else was still processing what emergency meant. "Get the attending down here," Danielle said to Rebecca, her voice already shifting back down from command register to something that sounded almost civilian again. Almost. "And call Dr. Ashford. Tell him his patient just coded and we've got her stable, but he's going to want to see this." She looked at Martinez. "You're going to want to document this exactly as it happened. Every detail. The time, the procedure, the materials used, who was present. Everything." Martinez's hands had started to tremble, but not from fear. From the recognition that he'd just watched someone operate at a level of competence that didn't match the file Dr. Ashford had been building. Doesn't follow protocol. Overstep boundaries. Questions authority. He was reading the words again in his head, but what he'd actually watched was a nurse save a child's life with her bare hands and a ballpoint pen, and the kind of training that didn't come from a community college nursing program. Danielle checked the 4 lines, confirmed the seal was holding, and felt the single dog tag on its broken chain press against her sternum under her scrubs. The metal was cold. It always was. It had been cold for 21 years, ever since a sergeant major named Thomas Chen had placed it in her hands outside a medevac helicopter and said words she still couldn't think about without something in her chest wanting to break. The night shift went quiet again. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Maya Chen slept on, unaware that at 0251 hours on a Tuesday morning in Norfolk, her oxygen saturation had stopped falling and started climbing because someone who wasn't supposed to be there had done something that nobody who actually belonged to Sacred Heart's hierarchy would have thought to attempt. What neither the resident nor Rebecca nor the night nursing supervisor who was about to arrive knew was that Dr. Ashford was going to wake up to a complication he hadn't anticipated. A patient saved. A procedure performed. Evidence that would need to be explained. And a nurse whose quiet competence had just become a problem that filing forms and night shift reassignments and careful humiliation could no longer contain. By morning, Dr. Ashford had already made 4 phone calls from his office on the 3rd floor. The first went to the hospital administrator at 6:44 a.m., his voice steady, professional, the tone of a man protecting an institution from liability. He spoke about Danielle for exactly 3 minutes, each word calculated. Failure to follow chain of command. Unsupervised intervention in a critical care situation. The kind of reckless behavior that ends in lawsuits. The administrator listened. Dr. Ashford ended with a phrase that would unlock every door: liability risk. Immediate termination recommended. The second call went to the nursing director at 7:15 a.m. Same tone. Different framing. This time it was about patient safety protocols, about maintaining the hierarchy that keeps hospitals functioning, about how permitting individual nurses to override physician judgment created chaos. She could have killed that child trying to be a hero, he said, and the nursing director's breath caught audibly through the phone. By the end of that call, Dr. Ashford had her agreement: liability risk. Immediate termination recommended. The third call was to his brother-in-law, an attorney who specialized in healthcare litigation, at 8:22 a.m. This one was different, quieter, more intimate. I need documentation that this was a protocol violation, not a save. His brother-in-law understood immediately. Papers would be filed. Records would be adjusted. The hospital would be protected. The call ended the same way: liability risk. Immediate termination recommended. The fourth call came at 9:06 a.m. to the State Licensing Board. Dr. Ashford reported Danielle for practicing medicine without a license, for emergency intervention outside scope of practice, for potential gross negligence resulting in patient trauma. The board official took notes. Took her name. Took the hospital name. Took Dr. Ashford's credentials and his medical opinion that she posed an ongoing threat to patient safety. The official's voice was neutral, bureaucratic, final: "We will investigate. Thank you for reporting this." For calls. For institutional doors closing. For different paths to the same destination. At noon, security walked her out. Not escorted, not accompanied, respectfully, walked out, the way you walk someone who has violated something sacred. Danielle pushed the cart with her belongings, a change of clothes, a stainless steel water bottle, the trauma shears with her initials engraved in fading letters, and wrapped in a plastic bag at the bottom, the single dog tag on its broken chain. Maya slept through it all on the pediatric ICU floor, her oxygen saturation steady at 94%, her mother sitting vigil in the uncomfortable reclining chair beside her bed, neither of them knowing that the nurse who had held open that girl's airway with improvised equipment and field hospital muscle memory had been erased from the building in 3 hours. The rain started as Danielle's car pulled out of the Sacred Heart parking garage. Norfolk rain in October, the kind that hits the pavement hard and doesn't let up, that turns the sky the color of old steel. She drove to her apartment in Columbia Park, a one-bedroom where she had lived for 7 years, where no one knew her except the landlord who collected rent on the first of each month. The lease was in the name Danielle Ross. The mailbox held bills addressed to D. Ross. The driver's license in her wallet said exactly that, nothing more. She set her scrubs on the kitchen table, 3 pairs, each one still holding the shape of her body, each one creased from the shift work, from bending over beds, from moving through hallways at 2 a.m. with a calm that came from having already survived the worst. The scrubs smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of hospital air recycled through industrial vac systems. She had worn these exact scrubs in the supply room 2 nights ago. She had worn them when Dr. Ashford made his call. She had worn them when she saved Maya Chen's life at 0313 hours. Now she folded them. First pair, she took it by the shoulders, lined up the seams the way she had been taught to line up a dress uniform, the way soldiers fold flags. Creased down the left sleeve. Creased down the right. The fabric whispered under her hands. The precision came from somewhere deeper than muscle memory. It came from a part of her that had learned once, long ago, that control over small things was the only control available when the world was exploding. When she folded the first pair, her hands were steady. When she started the second pair, she noticed they weren't trembling. The trembling would come later, if at all. Right now, there was only the geometry of folded cloth. Crease down each sleeve. Line the legs up at the ankles. Fold once. Fold twice. Each motion deliberate. Each fold sharp enough to cut. The apartment was quiet except for the rain hammering the windows, except for the occasional sound of a car passing on the street below, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She was alone. She was completely alone. And she was folding scrubs the way she had folded a flag once, over a coffin, with an officer from her unit standing to her left and another to her right, and everyone watching in absolute silence as the 3 of them, because that's all that was left of a 14-person unit, folded the colors down to a tight triangle that would fit in a ceremony box. The third pair took longer. Her hands found the rhythm, but something was different now. The muscle memory had shifted. The folding had become something else, not preparation, not precision, but surrender. Each crease was a small goodbye. The fabric that had covered her while she moved through the hospital, while she answered to just a nurse, while she listened to orders from a man who saw her as an obstacle, was now being returned. Folded. Prepared for the hospital laundry, where it would be washed in industrial machines with chemicals that would strip away any trace of the woman who had worn it. The fabric would come back clean, neutral, ready for the next person. She set the folded scrubs in a plastic Sacred Heart laundry bag, the kind that said "Return to Laundry" in red letters. 7 years of shifts. 7 years of moving through that hospital with a name that wasn't quite her own, a degree that was real but incomplete, a skill set she couldn't explain, a dog tag she kept hidden under her scrubs because the moment someone asked about it would be the moment everything collapsed. And now she was returning the uniform. This was the indignity, not the firing, not the humiliation, not the phone calls made by a man terrified of what she had seen in a supply room. This was it, standing in her apartment, returning the costume to the hospital, knowing that somewhere in that building, in the pediatric ICU on the 3rd floor, a little girl was breathing because of hands that had held her steady in a moment when every protocol said to wait, when every rule said to defer, when every institutional structure said that a nurse with no name could not possibly know what she was doing. The dog tag was still in her pocket. She held it for a moment, the cheap metal warm from her body, the stamped letters barely readable after 20 years, Chen, M. She looked at the laundry bag. She looked at the dog tag. For just a moment, the length of one breath, she thought about letting it fall, about watching it disappear into the laundry, about erasing the last physical proof that she had ever been anyone other than the woman being walked out of a hospital by security. And then her phone buzzed. The sound was so sudden, so unexpected in the silence of the apartment, that she nearly dropped the dog tag. It wasn't a text. It wasn't an email notification. It was something else, a sound she hadn't heard in 20 years, a frequency that lived only in one specific application, the kind that required a phone that wasn't supposed to exist, that lived in a drawer under her bed wrapped in a Faraday pouch, the kind of device that had a direct line to a specific command center in Arlington and could only be dialed or called in circumstances that had been deemed catastrophic. The phone in her desk drawer was ringing. And in the distance, far away but getting closer, she heard the low percussion of helicopter rotors beating the rain-heavy air above Norfolk, a sound like thunder that didn't stop, that kept approaching, that carried the weight of something massive and inevitable. The scrubs lay folded on the table, ready for their return to the laundry. Danielle stood in her apartment, the dog tag in one hand, the other hand reaching toward that drawer, listening to a phone ring that was supposed to be buried, that was supposed to be silent, that meant one of three things: catastrophic injury, direct attack on U.S. forces, or someone, somewhere, had just asked about Major Ross by her actual name. She had no idea what was about to happen. The Black Hawk descended through Norfolk's afternoon haze like a predator dropping from clouds. Rotor wash hammered the Sacred Heart helipad at 1,400 hours, shaking Windows 17 floors below. Two Marines in dress blues emerged before the rotors fully spun down, their movement synchronized in a way that made security personnel step back without being told. They moved through Sacred Heart's corridors with the terrifying fluid precision of men who had walked through worse than a civilian hospital. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The elevator doors slid open. They didn't wait for anyone to direct them. They already knew where they were going. The administrator's office on the 5th floor had never held this kind of silence. Dr. Ashford stood when the Marines entered, his face draining from surgeon's tan to something the color of old hospital sheets. One of the officers, a colonel with Silver Star ribbon blocks on his chest, placed both hands flat on the desk between them. "We're looking for Major Danielle Ross. Call sign Reaper. She works your ICU. We need her. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command that rearranged the air pressure in the room. "I don't know who," Ashford started. The second Marine didn't let him finish. He turned toward the door and said 3 words into his radio. "Send in Sergeant Major." The man who walked through that doorway moved like memory made solid. 40 pounds heavier than the officer who'd stood in Bagram 20 years ago, face lined like a map of every decision that had cost him something. But the eyes. The eyes were exactly the same as the morning he'd held his screaming daughter while a young lieutenant applied pressure to a severed femoral artery for 40 minutes, whispering promises that she would walk again, that she would dance again, that she would live. Sergeant Major Thomas Chen stood in the doorway, and his jaw clenched so hard you could hear it. "I need to see my daughter's medical file. And I need to see the nurse who saved her life. Again." Down in the pediatric ICU, Danielle didn't know yet. She was changing 4 bags in a patient room 3 doors from where Maya slept, her movements the practiced economy of someone who had learned long ago not to waste motion. Her scrub pocket held the dog tag on its broken chain. She'd retrieved it that morning from the apartment drawer where she kept it buried under thermal socks and memories she wasn't supposed to carry. Her phone had gone silent after the helicopter landed. She was waiting for it to ring again, waiting to know if this was catastrophic or calculated or something worse. The elevator doors opened on pediatric. Ashford's voice came first, rushed and defensive. "This is highly irregular, Sergeant Major. Personnel matters require proper, then silence. The kind of silence that happens when authority meets something larger than itself." In the conference room where Maya's file lay open on the mahogany table, Chen's finger traced Danielle's handwriting in the nursing notes. His voice cracked exactly once: patient coding, attending unresponsive, field intervention required. He looked up at the colonel. "She did it again. She saved her. Again." The colonel opened the file further. His voice dropped into the tone reserved for official testimony, the words landing like stones. "Major Ross received a Bronze Star for actions under fire in Helm and Province, 2004. Chen's hand trembled on the table. "A second Bronze Star for evacuation protocols at FOB Shank, 2006. Dr. Ashford's face went white. A Silver Star for Combat Medicine under direct fire at Kandahar Airfield, 2009. Silence from Ashford now. Complete silence. And 2 Purple Hearts, 1 for shrapnel wounds, 1 for the IED that took her off the flight line. She was medevaced to Walter Reed with a titanium rod in her spine and a discharge certificate that said she'd served 43 lives back to their families. 43. The colonel closed the file with finality. 44 if you count the little girl from Bagram who's sleeping 3 doors down from here. The FBI agent entered before Ashford could speak. She moved to the table and placed a flash drive beside the medical file. Special Agent Morrison, Bureau of Investigation. We've been monitoring your communications for 6 months, Dr. Ashford. Your pharmaceutical rep, your payment structure. Your margin percentages. She tapped the drive. All of it. Every conversation. Including the ones where you orchestrated a transfer and then attempted to plant false negligence reports in Major Ross's personnel file. That's conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and attempted destruction of evidence. The handwriting analysis is already complete. The timestamps are already documented. Ashford's chair scraped backward. He raised both hands. There's been a misunderstanding. I was protecting the hospital. The nurse, she was. Where is she? Chen's voice cut through the room like a blade. Not loud. Just final. 3 minutes later, security escorted Dr. Ashford from Sacred Heart with his hands behind his back, the metal cuffs clicking with each step past the nursing station where every RN and tech stood motionless, watching. The local news crews waiting in the parking lot, tips had been made, stories had been seeded, captured the whole sequence, the doctor being led out in handcuffs, the Marines in dress blues waiting at the entrance, the narrative already written in real time. Decorated war hero fired for saving a child's life. Doctor arrested for covering it up. The perp walk went viral in the time it took for the foredrip to cycle once. Danielle was in Maya's room when it happened. The girl was awake, confused, asking why her father was crying. Danielle sat on the bed's edge, her hand resting on Maya's shoulder with the gentleness of someone who'd forgotten how to carry softness until she had to. Your dad's just happy you're okay. Sometimes when people are really happy, their eyes leak a little. Maya thought about this with the seriousness of an 8-year-old. Do your eyes leak when you're happy? Danielle looked at her for a long moment. Not usually. I'm not very good at happy. You're good at other things though, Maya said. Dad says you saved my life. Through the window, Danielle watched the perp walk happen on the 6 o'clock news feed someone had turned on in the break room. She watched herself become the headline. She watched the Marine stand witness. She watched a career dissolve in the time it took for one man's arrogance to meet one woman's restraint. And she made a choice in that second. She could disappear back into civilian life, back into scrubs and anonymity, back into the carefully constructed fiction that she'd left the uniform behind. Or she could step back into the light. 2 years later, Maya Chen was 12 and no longer needed a cane. She walked into the VA hospital's new emergency medicine wing that bore the name Major Danielle Ross, MD, Trauma Director. The glass doors opened to a wing that smelled of new paint and possibility. Danielle was there, of course, still in scrubs because the title didn't matter as much as the work. She was checking a patient's first sight, 12 years of medical school compressed into a single smooth motion, when Maya found her. I wanted to come before I got too old, Maya said. Before I forgot what it meant. Danielle looked up. 2 decades of distance collapsed into a single moment of recognition. She reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out the dog tag on its broken chain. The metal was worn silver now, polished smooth by 20 years of being carried. She placed it in Maya's palm. You're old enough now. This is yours. It's time to carry your own courage. Maya held the weight of it. The tag that read Chen, M. The tag that meant her father had survived. The tag that meant Danielle had survived. The tag that meant that sometimes the people who've seen the worst are the ones who give the most, not to get recognition, not to be healed, but because they remember what it means to be saved. Will you tell me the story? Maya asked. The real one. Danielle smiled, actually smiled, the kind that moved her whole face, and gestured toward her office. We're going to need coffee. And time. And you need to understand something, the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. For 20 years, I was trembling with restraint. And sometimes the quietest person in the room isn't quiet because she's weak. She's quiet because she's strong enough not to need the noise. If you've ever known someone with a quiet strength that nobody recognized, someone carrying a secret that changed everything, someone who chose to keep helping even after the system tried to break them, hit that subscribe button. Because these stories aren't just about one nurse. They're about all the invisible heroes walking through our hospitals, our neighborhoods, our lives, people we never think to ask about. What would you have done if you'd been in Danielle's position? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have fought back? Leave a comment. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that heroes don't always announce themselves. They just show up. They just help. They just keep going.